Elira Venn thought she had buried her husband, Renzo Calloway, 15 years ago after a tragic maritime accident off the coast of Portugal. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment she spotted him, alive, smiling, and very much at ease, on a quiet London street, holding the hand of a woman and laughing with two children who called him Dad. In 2009, Elira Calloway lived a quiet life, nestled in a modest craftsman-style home on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. She had met her husband, Renzo Calloway, 6 years earlier through a mutual acquaintance at a marine safety conference. Elira was an administrative assistant for the state's environmental agency, while Renzo worked as a marine engineer, designing and maintaining large shipping vessels that traveled across oceans. His job kept him away from home for weeks, sometimes months, but Elira never complained. She trusted him implicitly and admired his sense of adventure, something she lacked herself. He brought her postcards from every port, tiny trinkets from South America, and exotic spices from the Middle East. Their life was simple but stable, their routine steady despite his absences. That winter, Renzo took an assignment aboard the Orion Glider, a bulk cargo ship bound for Norway. He left in late November, promising to be home in time for Christmas. But December passed with no word. At first, Elira wasn't alarmed. Storms often delayed communications, and Renzo once went 3 weeks without internet access. She called his shipping company, Artex Marine Systems, but received only vague assurances that the vessel was delayed due to weather. When weeks stretched into a month, the anxiety in Elira's chest grew unbearable. Then came the knock on the door. A man from the Coast Guard and a woman from Artex stood solemnly at her porch. They told her that the Orion glider had last communicated via satellite on December 18th, somewhere in the North Atlantic. A brutal storm had swallowed the region, and all attempts to reach the vessel since had failed. Rescue missions were launched, but the wreckage was never found. No bodies were recovered. Only a single lifebuoy with the ship's name washed ashore on the Scottish coast days later. The vessel was presumed sunk, and the crew of 19 declared lost at sea. Renzo Calloway was officially declared dead on January 10, 2010. Elira felt her world collapse. The days that followed passed in a fog of denial and confusion. Her home felt frozen in time, his toothbrush still in the bathroom, his shoes by the front door, his half-finished crossword puzzle resting on the kitchen counter. She refused to believe he was gone. Friends offered condolences and casseroles. Strangers sent sympathy cards. She buried an empty coffin in Greenlawn Cemetery with a headstone bearing his name, though part of her felt like she was participating in a lie. How could someone just vanish without a trace? She couldn't cry at the funeral because it didn't feel real. She kept waking up at night expecting to hear Renzo's footsteps down the hall. Eventually, the insurance process began. She received a modest payout. Artex Marine was sued by some of the other families, but Elira stayed away from the legal battle. She wanted nothing to do with the sea anymore. Renzo's life insurance covered her mortgage and gave her enough to restart, but it never filled the hole inside her. She left her job, sold their house, and moved into a small apartment downtown. No one saw much of her after that. Years passed. Elira lived quietly, working part-time at a library and spending her evenings reading novels she never finished. She kept to herself, never dated, never traveled. Her friends stopped calling. Birthdays and anniversaries came and went in silence. She had no children, no close family left. The world moved on, but she didn't. To her, Renzo remained suspended, in time, forever 38, somewhere lost beneath the waves, unreachable and unfinished. Despite everything, she never let go of a faint thread of hope. Sometimes, in her dreams, Renzo would knock on the door, drenched in salt water, smiling, apologizing for the delay. She would wake up gasping, torn between heartbreak and relief. She even kept his old passport in a drawer, worn from years of use. Something inside her refused to fully believe the story she had been told. As the 15-year anniversary of his disappearance Approached, she felt an invisible pull, one she couldn't name, only follow. She didn't yet know that the truth, long buried, was about to rise from the depths in the most unexpected way. 15 years after Renzo's disappearance, Elira Calloway decided it was time to live again, or at least try. She hadn't left the country since his death, and something inside her whispered that a change of scenery might help break the invisible chains holding her to the past. On a whim, she booked a solo trip to England. There was no agenda, no itinerary, just an aching desire to be somewhere far from the places that reminded her of everything she lost. She chose Stratford-upon-Avon, a small town famous for its connection to William Shakespeare. The brochures promised quaint cobbled streets, riverside walks and quiet gardens, a place untouched by the chaos of modern life. It sounded like the perfect place for someone trying to disappear into peace. When she arrived, she immediately felt comforted by the town's charm. Old brick buildings leaned into each other, and the Avon River sparkled under the early summer sun. There were tourists everywhere, but none of them knew her. She was a shadow among strangers, and it felt strangely freeing. On her second afternoon, Elira wandered into a cozy outdoor cafe nestled beside a narrow footpath along the water. She ordered a pot of tea and found a corner table shaded by ivy. The place was busy, but not loud. Conversations floated around her like background music. She sipped her drink and let her mind drift, telling herself not to think of Renzo, not today, not here. But then, something pulled her attention. Across the terrace, seated at a small round table, was a man with sandy brown hair and a familiar tilt of the head. He was laughing, full-bodied and carefree, a sound she hadn't heard in years, but would never forget. A woman sat next to him, blonde and younger, with a polished look that made her seem like someone from a travel magazine. 2 children, perhaps 8 and 10, sat beside them, bickering over a shared pastry. The man leaned in to referee, and that's when Elira saw the scar. A small, crescent-shaped line at the base of his neck. Her heart stopped. She had seen that scar 1,000 times. Renzo got it during a boating accident in 2002, a story he loved to retell with dramatic flair. Elira stared, frozen in place, her teacup trembling in her hand. The man's features were older, worn by time, but there was no doubt in her mind. It was Renzo. Not someone who looked like him, not a coincidence. It was him. Laughing, eating, alive. 1,000 thoughts crashed into her at once. Had she gone mad? Was this a hallucination, a cruel trick of her mind? She reached into her bag, hands shaking, and pulled out her phone. She zoomed in and took several photos, careful not to attract attention. The man turned slightly, revealing more of his profile. It was unmistakable. The line of his jaw, the way he smiled with only one side of his mouth. Elira left the cafe without touching the rest of her tea. Her legs moved on autopilot as she walked blindly back toward her rented room. When she arrived, she locked the door and sat on the bed, gasping for breath. Her fingers trembled as she opened the photos. She zoomed in again and again. The image was grainy, but it was him. The man she had mourned, buried, grieved for. The man who had vanished in a storm and left behind a widow. What was he doing in England? Who were those people? Why had he never come back? Questions flooded her mind, each one sharper than the last, but the most painful of all was the realization that she had spent 15 years grieving someone who had chosen to leave her. She couldn't sleep that night. Her thoughts spun like a carousel, images of Renzo from her memories clashing with the version she had seen that day, happy, alive, whole. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but most of all, she needed to know the truth. The next morning, Elira packed her bag, extended her stay by 2 weeks, and began researching private investigators in the area. She needed answers, because what she saw at that cafe had rewritten the last 15 years of her life in an instant. Her husband was not dead. He had simply started over, Elira Calloway spent the next 3 days in a fog of disbelief. Her world, which had been built on grief, had been cracked open by a single moment in a quiet English cafe. She wasn't prepared for the wave of emotions that came next. Shock, betrayal, rage, even guilt. She tried to rationalize it, to make sense of the impossible. Had Renzo suffered amnesia? Was he abducted and forced into a new life? Had he somehow survived and been too ashamed to return? But none of those explanations felt right. Deep down, she suspected something darker. She contacted a local private investigator named Colvin Ray, a retired detective with a reputation for solving difficult cases. He met her in a discreet office above a bookstore and listened quietly as she told him her story. She showed him the photos she had taken, including the zoomed-in shot of the man's face. Colvin leaned in, studying the details. When she mentioned the name Renzo Calloway, the former detective's eyebrows lifted. It wasn't a common name, and it gave the case a strange gravity. Colvin promised to begin discreet surveillance. Within 2 days, he returned with astonishing results. The man in the cafe was now living in a charming Tudor-style home just 20 minutes outside town, under the name Emery Brandt. He worked remotely as a maritime consultant, had no criminal record, and had been residing in England for nearly a decade. His wife, a woman named Sabina Marin, was a former flight attendant originally from Dublin. Their children, Lennox and Mira, were enrolled in private school. To all appearances, they were a normal, happy family. Elira sat in silence as Colvin laid out the photos and timelines. It was like seeing pieces of her past sewn into a different life. There were birthdays, backyard barbecues, school plays, and smiling portraits, all with Renzo, now Emery, right in the center. The betrayal felt like a physical blow. She had buried a coffin for this man. She had lit candles for him on every anniversary of his disappearance. She had lived in sorrow while he played father and husband to strangers. Still, she needed more than proof. She needed motive. How had he vanished so cleanly? And why? The investigation deepened. Colvin pulled shipping manifests from 2009, spoke to contacts in the maritime world, and uncovered something strange. The Orion glider, the ship Renzo had allegedly died on, had no official record of sinking. It was deregistered weeks after the storm and sold quietly to a South American firm, then renamed and repurposed under a shell company. There had been no formal inquiry, no lawsuits against the company stuck. Most of the crew's families, like Elira, had been given hush payments or quietly settled through maritime insurance. It began to look less like a tragedy and more like a cover-up. Colvin believed that Renzo had faked his death with help from powerful players in the shipping company. Perhaps there was fraud involved, or maybe he was running from something. Either way, it became clear he hadn't been swept away by chance. He had chosen to vanish, and he had planned it. Elira stared at the walls of her temporary flat, now covered with surveillance photos and printed documents. Her entire life felt like a constructed lie. Her marriage had not ended with a tragic accident, but with deception so elaborate it spanned continents. What kind of man could look his wife in the eyes for 6 years and then disappear without a trace? And what kind of man could start a new family while the one he left behind mourned him like a widow? She wanted to confront him, to demand the truth from his own lips, but she couldn't just knock on his door. This wasn't a movie. If she approached him publicly, he could deny everything. Worse, he might flee again, slipping away just like before. She needed leverage, evidence that couldn't be ignored. So she kept her distance, watching his routines through Colvin's updates. She noted the times he walked his dog, the way he dropped his children off at school, the way he held Sabina's hand at the local farmer's market. Each moment deepened the wound. Renzo hadn't vanished. He had erased her. And now, she was determined to uncover everything he tried so hard to bury. Elira's obsession grew sharper with each passing day. She barely ate, barely slept. Her mind lived in the space between the man Renzo used to be and the stranger named Emery Brandt. The duality haunted her. She questioned everything from their wedding day to the final kiss before his last voyage. Had he always planned this? Was she just a stepping stone to another life? Her emotions no longer came in waves. They were a flood. Colvin Ray, the private investigator, continued feeding her updates like clockwork. He was careful, methodical, and discreet. After tailing Emery for another week, he noticed something new. Every Thursday afternoon, Emery would take a long walk alone to a small hilltop cemetery on the outskirts of town. Colvin followed from a distance and saw him pause at a particular headstone each time. The name on the grave read, Elias Brandt. No birth or death dates, no epitaph, just a name etched in stone. This detail puzzled both of them. Emery wasn't visiting the grave of a known relative, not someone publicly connected to him. Was it symbolic? Was it part of his lie? They dug into local records, and Colvin soon discovered that Elias Brandt didn't legally exist. Not in the UK, not in any database. The grave had been purchased under Sabina Merrin's name. It was a fabricated identity, a planted story. Elira began to believe that the name on the stone was a metaphor. Renzo had buried his former life under a false identity, even giving that falsehood a headstone. In his mind, Elias Brandt was the version of himself that had died, the final piece of his reinvention. The knowledge made her sick. She had cried over an empty coffin. He had mourned a fake man. Then came another twist. Colvin obtained surveillance footage from a local security firm, showing Emery at a post office 2 towns away, mailing a thick envelope to an address in the Cayman Islands. The package was marked with financial documents. It wasn't routine mail. It was international, private, and consistent. He sent similar packages every 2 months. Colvin pulled banking records and traced a web of accounts linked to shell corporations. It was a deep financial maze, but at the center of it was a discovery that stunned Elira. In the months following Renzo's supposed death, nearly $2.8 million had been transferred to offshore accounts using maritime insurance payouts. All of it tied to companies that Renzo had quietly built through proxies. The storm that allegedly killed him had been a cover for insurance fraud. Elira was a pawn in his plan. Her grief had been currency, proof of loss used to secure the payout. The depth of the betrayal became unbearable. But the next revelation nearly broke her. Colvin found medical records that showed Renzo had visited a private clinic in Portugal 6 months before his disappearance. The documents revealed a vasectomy procedure, dated 2 weeks before their anniversary, during a time he had claimed to be overseas for work. Elira had always wanted children, and Renzo had told her they'd try after one last contract at sea. Now she knew the truth. He had never intended to build a family with her. He had carved out a new life long before his fake death. Sabina Merrin wasn't just a replacement. She had likely been waiting in the wings for years. Their children, Lennox and Mira, were not biologically his. That fact only made it worse. He hadn't just faked his death. He had staged an entirely new reality, down to the smallest, cruelest detail. Elira began compiling every piece of information into a master file: photos, bank transfers, fake graves, clinic records. The evidence formed a picture so clear, it left no doubt. Renzo had planned everything. His disappearance wasn't a moment of survival or fear. It was ambition, greed, and calculated abandonment. She reached a breaking point. Revenge started whispering to her louder than grief ever had. He didn't deserve to live a second life free of consequence. She thought of exposing him publicly, but that would be noisy, chaotic, possibly ineffective. What she wanted was something deeper. She didn't just want him punished. She wanted him to feel what it was like to lose everything. Just as he had made her do. Elira didn't know how, yet. But she knew the next time she saw Renzo, face to face, it wouldn't be by accident. It would be the final move in a game he never realized she was playing. Elira returned home to the United States with a storm brewing inside her. Every mile of distance from Renzo only sharpened her focus. The final confrontation wasn't something she could walk into unarmed. She needed more than truth. She needed a way to ensure he couldn't run again, couldn't slip through the cracks like he had before. Quiet revenge wasn't enough. She wanted justice. But first, she needed the system to believe the story, and for that, she had to become strategic. She took her master file and flew to Washington, D.C., where she scheduled a discreet meeting with a federal investigator who specialized in insurance fraud and international identity crime. She had chosen him carefully. His record showed no leaks, no political agendas. When she presented the documents, he was visibly unsettled. The forged maritime death certificate, the offshore transfers, the false grave, and the hidden clinic records painted a damning picture. Renzo Calloway, now Emery Brandt, was not just a liar. He was a criminal who had stolen millions, deceived global insurance networks, and lived undetected for over a decade. The agent promised to move swiftly, but warned her that the case, though compelling, was complicated by its international nature. British authorities would need to be involved. Papers had to be filed, records requested, extradition potentially coordinated. But once the wheels turned, they couldn't be stopped. Elira didn't wait idly. She returned to the UK under a new identity, secured with legal help from the investigator's office. She rented a flat in a village near Emery's home and began watching him again, this time with an entirely different purpose. She wasn't the grieving widow anymore. She was the architect of his collapse. Weeks passed as the investigation developed behind the scenes. One morning, Colvin called her with a clipped voice. He had received word through unofficial channels that Interpol had issued a preliminary notice. Renzo's name was now in the system, flagged for financial crime, identity theft, and insurance fraud. The moment the warrant was finalized, local authorities would make the arrest. Elira decided it was time. She waited until Saturday, when Emery and his wife Sabina took their children to a lakeside market, a routine Colvin had noted weeks earlier. Elira followed at a distance, blending with the crowd. She stood by a flower stall, watching the scene unfold. Renzo, holding Sabina's hand, laughing as Mira begged for cotton candy. He looked so normal, so undeserving. Then, without warning, she stepped out of the crowd and stood directly in his path. He saw her instantly and froze. His face drained of color, mouth slightly open, eyes wide with disbelief. In that instant, Sabina looked confused, then suspicious. But Renzo, Emery, he looked terrified. Before he could speak, Elira turned and walked away. She didn't need to scream or make a scene. Her expression had said everything. It was the last time he would walk freely among strangers. 3 days later, police arrested Emery Brandt at his home. The charges were read in front of his family. Sabina collapsed to the floor. His children watched through the window as he was handcuffed. The story made headlines across Europe and trickled into American media. Man declared dead, found living in UK with secret family, faked his own death to commit fraud. During the trial, the truth unraveled in full. Testimonies from former co-workers confirmed that Renzo had plotted his disappearance with the help of corrupt company executives. He had forged ship logs, doctored death reports, and manipulated his own wife's grief to cash in on insurance payouts. He had changed his identity using stolen documents and funneled money through dummy corporations in South America and the Caribbean. His betrayal of Elira wasn't just personal, it was criminal. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Sabina divorced him immediately. The children, too young to fully understand, were moved to live with relatives. Elira didn't attend the sentencing. She didn't need to. She returned to her quiet home and resumed her life, piece by piece. For the first time in 15 years, she felt something that resembled peace. She had faced the ghost of her past, uncovered the layers of lies, and turned grief into action. Renzo had disappeared to start over. But in the end, Elira had the final word. He had vanished once. She made sure he would never vanish again.